Rachel Turner stood in front of the large mirror in the staff lounge of SkyLux Airlines, adjusting the collar of her uniform. The crisp fabric shimmered under the fluorescent lights, and she smoothed the edges of her name tag. She had been with the company for over 15 years, and the uniform still felt as much a part of her as her own skin. Skylux was renowned for its luxury, its impeccable service, and most importantly, its exclusivity. Every flight she worked on was an opportunity to reinforce her belief that she had the best job in the world, an elite role serving an elite clientele. For Rachel, the airport was a battlefield. She had learned long ago to assess the passengers as they entered the terminal. She could tell who would be demanding, who would be easy to please, and, perhaps most importantly, who might challenge her authority. Over the years, Rachel had come to pride herself on her ability to predict exactly what type of passenger she would encounter. With her sharp intuition and experience, she was always prepared. Today was no different. Rachel looked out over the bustling terminal as the boarding gate for Skylux Flight 306 to New York City opened. She knew that this would be a long flight, and long flights meant long hours of anticipating every need of every passenger. She had just finished her pre-flight checks, polishing the glassware, ensuring the first-class lounge was stocked, and preparing her team for what would surely be another smooth flight. But her mind was already working overtime, scanning the crowd for those little details that would tell her how to manage this group. At this moment, passengers were beginning to board the plane, and Rachel Turner stood at the gate, preparing for the upcoming flight from Los Angeles to New York. Long flights always brought a certain level of busyness, but Rachel thrived in this environment. First class was where she felt most in control. With 15 years of experience as a flight attendant, she prided herself on her ability to read passengers, whether they were easygoing or demanding. She always felt a step ahead, predicting needs before they were even voiced. But when the Johnson family walked up, something about them made Rachel's usually confident demeanor falter. James and Camille Johnson, along with their two children, walked toward the gate. The first thing Rachel noticed was how ordinary they seemed. Other first-class passengers often flaunted their wealth with flashy suits and accessories, but the Johnsons were different. James wore a well-tailored navy blue suit, understated yet impeccable. Camille's dress was simple, elegant, but unremarkable compared to the usual display of wealth she encountered. Their children, well-behaved and quiet, followed in line without fuss. Rachel's instincts buzzed uncomfortably. This isn't how first-class passengers are supposed to look, she thought. First class was for people who fit the part, who had an aura of success that was hard to miss. But the Johnsons were too normal, and that was what unsettled Rachel. She glanced down at their boarding passes. First class. Everything was in order. So why did she feel so uneasy? "Good evening," Rachel said with a practiced smile, scanning their tickets. "First class, right this way." As she led them onto the plane, Rachel couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in her chest. She kept watching them out of the corner of her eye. James and Camille moved with a quiet dignity, unhurried and composed. Their children were silent, but not in the chaotic way children often were on planes. They didn't ask for anything, didn't act entitled. They simply existed, almost as if they were immune to the small anxieties that came with flying. Rachel's mind raced as she led them down the aisle. She'd been doing this for years, but there was something about this family that felt wrong. They didn't belong in her world of polished luxury and sleek service. They were too quiet, too composed for first class. It was as if they were above all of this, detached from the expectations of the space. As they approached the first class section, Rachel found herself slowing. She was aware of the passengers behind them, who were already looking at their tickets, anxious to get settled. But something inside her urged her to make a choice. It wasn't about the tickets or their behavior. It was about how they looked. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, her voice suddenly tight. "There seems to be an issue with your seating. I'm going to move you to the back of the plane." She gestured towards the rear section. James paused for just a moment, his calm gaze meeting hers. A flicker of confusion passed across his face, but he said nothing. Camille's expression was unreadable, though Rachel could sense a subtle shift in her demeanor, a slight tension in the way she held herself. Of course, James replied simply, as if this wasn't the first time they had encountered such treatment. Rachel felt a flash of unease, but she didn't let it show. She guided them to the back of the plane, past the spacious first-class seats and towards the narrow rows near the restrooms. The quiet family followed her without protest, the children walking silently behind their parents. Rachel's pulse quickened as she continued her walk toward the rear. Once they had settled into their seats, Rachel turned to leave, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an almost eerie calm around the Johnson family as they sat down. James and Camille didn't argue, didn't complain. There was no drama. There was just an air of quiet resignation, as if they had expected this somehow, as if they knew exactly how things would unfold. Rachel moved back toward the front of the plane, trying to shake off the discomfort that clung to her. She busied herself with checking on the other passengers, offering drinks, adjusting pillows, and making small talk, but her mind kept wandering back to the Johnsons. They sat in the back, perfectly composed, completely unruffled by the change in seating. Rachel couldn't help but feel a growing sense of doubt, a strange sensation that they weren't just passengers. They were something more, something that she couldn't yet understand. And for the first time in years, Rachel felt like she had lost control. As the plane cruised smoothly through the skies, Rachel tried to focus on her duties. The hum of the engines and the soft murmur of passengers filled the cabin, but her mind kept drifting back to the Johnsons. They sat quietly in the back of the plane, their heads slightly tilted as they looked out the small windows. The children were content, coloring in their activity books, and Camille, as poised as ever, read a novel with a calm, unhurried expression. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had made her decision, had justified it in her mind, but something inside her gnawed at her. She had moved the Johnsons to the back of the plane, not because of any technical issue, but because she didn't feel like they belonged. There was something about their quiet grace, their composed nature, that unsettled her, and it left her questioning herself. Every time Rachel passed by their seats, she couldn't help but glance at them. There was no noise, no demands, no signs of discomfort. James and Camille weren't the type to complain, but their serene demeanor felt like a subtle challenge, as if they knew something she didn't. The other first-class passengers, by contrast, had all settled into their roles as entitled customers. They had already been served drinks, snacks, and warm towels, the usual luxuries expected from the airline. But when Rachel approached the Johnsons, she hesitated. They hadn't requested anything. No drinks, no food, no pleasantries. She wondered if they were silently judging her, if they could see through the mask of professionalism she had worked so hard to cultivate. Rachel told herself she was overthinking it. She was just doing her job, wasn't she? But as the flight progressed, a growing sense of discomfort filled her chest. She had already walked past the Johnson family several times, offering the other passengers first-class service, but something kept her from offering them the same courtesy. It was as though their calmness, their lack of neediness, made her feel exposed. It was as though they saw her, truly saw her, and she didn't like what they saw. Camille looked up briefly as Rachel passed, her eyes meeting Rachel's for the briefest of moments. There was no judgment in Camille's expression, but it felt like something unspoken passed between them. Rachel's stomach tightened. What did Camille think of her? Did she know that Rachel had moved them to the back without cause? Did she recognize the subtle discrimination behind Rachel's actions? Rachel quickly turned away, focusing on the other passengers. She tried to ignore the whispers around the cabin. They weren't directed at her, but she couldn't help but feel that something had changed. A quiet tension had settled over the plane, something that wasn't there before. Rachel's steps grew slower as she moved back toward the galley. She found herself glancing over her shoulder once again toward the back of the plane. The Johnsons were still there, sitting quietly, still not asking for anything, not demanding attention. It was unsettling. Rachel couldn't understand it. Why didn't they want anything? Why didn't they make the same demands that other first-class passengers often made, expecting her to run around catering to their every whim? She could feel her pulse quicken with each passing minute. Her mind kept returning to the idea that she had somehow made a mistake, but she was determined not to let it show. Her job was to maintain order, to ensure that the flight ran smoothly, and she would do that no matter what. As Rachel turned back to face the galley, she tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach. She could hear the quiet murmur of passengers talking about their experiences, the excellent service, the food, the comfort of the flight. It was what she was used to hearing, and it should have comforted her. But it didn't. Not this time. She reached for a tray of champagne flutes, her hands trembling slightly. Melissa, a newer flight attendant, was preparing a batch of drinks at the counter. She looked up and smiled. "Everything okay out there?" Melissa asked, placing a tray of freshly poured champagne in front of Rachel. Rachel hesitated. She didn't want to admit what she was feeling. She didn't want to admit that her usual calm had been shaken by something so subtle. "It's fine," Rachel said, her voice tight. "Just that family in the back. I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on it." She paused, glancing over at the Johnsons again. "There's something about them that doesn't sit right with me." Melissa looked toward the back of the plane where the Johnsons sat calmly. "They seem nice enough to me," she said, her tone neutral. "I haven't noticed anything unusual." Rachel nodded stiffly. "I think I'm just imagining things." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She wasn't imagining things. Something was off, and she didn't know how to shake the feeling. She could feel her grip on the situation slipping. The confidence that had carried her through so many flights, the unwavering professionalism she prided herself on, it was all beginning to feel fragile. And for the first time, Rachel wasn't sure what to do about it. The flight continued smoothly, but the unease inside Rachel grew stronger with every passing minute. Her mind kept returning to the Johnson family who sat quietly in the back. She couldn't help but notice how unbothered they were, as if nothing in the world could disturb their calm. They hadn't requested anything, hadn't made any demands. They didn't even look out of the window much, just sat, composed, as though they were content with simply being there. Rachel, on the other hand, felt anything but content. As she moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to other passengers, she found herself glancing over her shoulder toward the back of the plane more often than she wanted to admit. The Johnsons' silence was almost suffocating. It felt like they were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She tried to shake the feeling. They're just passengers, she told herself. They're just sitting there like everyone else. But as the flight continued, Rachel couldn't stop herself from glancing at them. They had settled into their seats as though they belonged there, without any signs of discomfort or the usual complaints that many first-class passengers made. It was a direct contrast to the usual chaos of her job. Why weren't they causing trouble? Why didn't they demand attention like the others? It was a question she couldn't shake. She reached the front of the cabin again, offering drinks to a few of the passengers who were now enjoying their meals. It was the same routine, but her mind was elsewhere. Each time she passed the Johnsons, their calmness unnerved her. Their lack of need was both unsettling and, strangely, a little too perfect. It made Rachel feel exposed, as though they could see through her veneer of professionalism. As she was heading back toward the galley, she overheard a conversation between two passengers sitting near the middle of the plane. One of them, an older woman, was speaking in hushed tones, but Rachel could still catch the drift of the conversation. "Did you notice the family in the back?" the woman asked her companion, her voice low but clear. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She quickly turned her attention to the two women, pretending to check on their drinks, but her mind was already racing. The other passenger, a man in his late 40s, responded casually, "Yeah, they seem like a nice family, but I can't help but feel like they're being ignored back there. No drinks, no snacks. It's odd, isn't it?" Rachel felt a pang of guilt, but she quickly masked it. "I'm sure it's just a mix-up," she said, smiling politely. "We're doing our best to make sure everyone gets served." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue further. "I suppose, but it doesn't look right." The woman nodded in agreement. "It feels deliberate," she murmured, glancing back at the Johnsons. Rachel felt her stomach churn. The words hit harder than she expected. She knew that the Johnsons had been overlooked, and her conscience began to weigh on her. She wasn't the kind of person who was usually swayed by gossip, but something about their words stung, like an accusation she wasn't ready to confront. Deliberate. The word echoed in her mind. Was it deliberate? Did she want to believe it was a mistake, a simple oversight? Or had her decision to move them to the back been motivated by something deeper, something she had refused to acknowledge? The thought made her feel small, uncomfortable. She quickly turned to leave, but as she did, she caught a glance of the Johnsons in the back of the plane. Camille was looking out of the window now, her hands folded neatly in her lap. James was reading a book, his posture relaxed, but there was something about him, something that made Rachel feel as though he could see right through her. The feeling of dread grew inside her, but she quickly turned away, focusing on the task at hand. But now, every movement she made felt strained. She felt like she was being watched, like the other passengers were waiting for her to slip up, and the Johnsons were the silent witnesses to her failure. As the flight neared its halfway point, Rachel found herself unable to shake the growing discomfort. The whispers between passengers had become more frequent, and the tension in the air was palpable. The once soothing hum of the engines now seemed to amplify her thoughts, pushing her deeper into her own doubts. When she finally returned to the galley, she was quiet, trying to gather her thoughts. Melissa, the younger flight attendant, noticed her discomfort. "Everything okay?" Melissa asked, her tone gentle. Rachel nodded, but the lie sat heavy in her throat. "Yeah, fine. Just a bit off today. I think I'm just tired." Melissa raised an eyebrow but didn't press. You've been handling the cabin really well. You're doing great." Rachel forced a smile. "Thanks. I just need to focus." But the truth was, she was losing focus. The doubts were growing louder with each passing minute. The Johnson family was always in the corner of her mind, their quiet presence like a shadow that wouldn't leave her alone. What if they knew? What if they could see through the thin veil of professionalism she had built over the years? As she stood there, trying to collect herself, Rachel realized that the tension was no longer just in the cabin. It was inside her too, gnawing at her with a sense of unease that she couldn't escape. As the plane descended into New York, the usual hustle of the cabin didn't feel as routine as it usually did for Rachel. The sky outside darkened, and the city lights below flickered like distant stars, but inside the plane, an oppressive silence settled. Rachel moved through the aisles, finishing her rounds, but her mind was elsewhere. The whispers, the guilt, the unease, all of it had been building throughout the flight, and now it felt unbearable. She found herself walking past the Johnsons' seats once again, her eyes darting toward them involuntarily. This time, though, it wasn't just an uncomfortable feeling, Haley. It was a sense of inevitability. They hadn't asked for anything, hadn't even looked at her directly since the last interaction. But their silence now felt like an accusation, one Rachel couldn't escape. She turned her gaze away quickly, but as she moved down the aisle, she noticed something in her peripheral vision. James had slipped his phone back into his pocket. Camille exchanged a glance with him, one Rachel couldn't quite read. It wasn't angry, it wasn't even disappointed. It was something else entirely, something that made Rachel's skin prickle. As she made her way to the galley, her thoughts continued to swirl. The pressure of it all was starting to weigh heavily on her. The whispers had stopped, but they still echoed in her head. What had she done? Was her instinct to move the Johnsons to the back of the plane a sign of something deeper? A bias she had refused to see in herself? "Rachel, can I have a word?" came a voice from behind her, interrupting her thoughts. She turned to see her supervisor, Captain Harris, standing at the entrance to the galley. Her stomach dropped. She could see the look in his eyes, serious, almost too calm. Rachel's heart began to pound. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, she felt exposed. "Sure," she said, her voice tight. Captain Harris led her away from the main cabin toward a small office space near the cockpit. The lights were dim in the hallway, and Rachel's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Had the Johnsons complained? Had someone seen what she had done? Had it reached the company yet? "Rachel," Captain Harris began, his voice steady but laced with concern, "I need you to understand something. The Johnsons aren't just passengers on this flight." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? He continued. James and Camille Johnson are not only frequent travelers with us, they are the owners of SkyLux Airlines. They hold a majority stake in the company. Rachel froze. The words didn't quite register at first, and when they did, her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Her mind raced, she tried to process the information. The Johnsons, owners of the airline? The family she had moved to the back of the plane? The family she had subconsciously judged as out of place? Captain Harris didn't give her time to respond. They filed a formal complaint, he said, and it's about you. Rachel felt the color drain from her face as the weight of her actions hit her all at once. The guilt that had been eating away at her for hours now had a tangible form. It wasn't just her mistake, it was a professional failure, and now it was going to cost her. I didn't mean, Rachel began, but her words faltered. She didn't even know where to begin. How could she explain what had happened? How could she defend her actions when even she didn't understand them? Captain Harris sighed, clearly uncomfortable but still professional. I know you didn't mean any harm, Rachel, but the fact is, your decision to move them to the back was unacceptable. We don't tolerate discrimination here. You've been a great asset to this team for years, but I need you to understand the severity of this. Rachel stood there, speechless, as the full weight of the situation settled in. She had made an error in judgment, and now she had to face the consequences. But there was something deeper in Captain Harris's words that cut through her, the realization that her actions had been more than just a mistake. They had been driven by something inside her, something she had tried to ignore. You'll need to report to HR when we land, Captain Harris said, his voice steady. They'll handle the next steps. But for now, I want you to take a seat and relax. We'll talk more once we're on the ground. Rachel nodded, though it felt like the floor had fallen out from beneath her. She made her way back to the cabin, her heart heavy with the truth. The Johnsons hadn't just been passengers. They hadn't just been another family traveling first class. They were the reason SkyLux Airlines had built its reputation. And now, because of her, they knew what she had done. And worse, they knew what it said about her. As the plane began its final descent into New York, Rachel found herself staring blankly out of the window. The city lights below looked distant, unreachable. She felt like an outsider in her own life, as though the world had shifted around her and she was no longer in control. She couldn't shake the weight of her own biases, the recognition that what had started as a small, seemingly harmless decision had now unraveled her world. Rachel was faced with a choice now, whether to confront the truth and learn from her mistakes or continue to bury them deep within herself. The flight landed with a jolt, and Rachel's mind was already spiraling. She knew that things would never be the same again. The plane had finally landed, and the usual post-flight hustle began as passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Rachel felt out of place, as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. The overwhelming tension she had been carrying throughout the flight now settled into her bones. Her heart raced, and her mind felt foggy as she made her way down the narrow aisle to the back of the plane. She had been told by Captain Harris to meet with the Johnsons in the VIP lounge as soon as the flight was over. Her stomach twisted in knots. It wasn't a formal meeting yet, but the moment she stepped into that lounge, she knew there would be no escaping the consequences of her actions. As she entered the lounge, the heavy glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, and she was immediately aware of the calm but unmistakable presence of James and Camille Johnson. They were seated near the windows, speaking in hushed tones, but as Rachel approached, they both turned to face her. James looked every bit the dignified businessman she had seen earlier, his eyes unreadable, while Camille's gaze was piercing, unwavering. She didn't smile at Rachel. Instead, her expression was firm, as if she were bracing herself for a confrontation. Rachel's pulse quickened. This was it. She had no idea what they would say, but she knew the gravity of the situation. She had been wrong. She had made a decision based on an assumption, and now the truth was crashing down on her. Rachel, please sit down, James said, his voice calm but with an edge of authority. Camille remained silent, her eyes fixed on Rachel as if waiting for her to speak first. Rachel nodded and sat down, her legs feeling weak. She could feel the sweat on the back of her neck, and she struggled to maintain her composure. What do I say? she thought. How do I begin to explain myself when I don't even fully understand what I've done? James leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, but I want to make something clear, Rachel. What happened on the flight was not a mistake. It was deliberate. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and she felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Camille picked up where James left off, her voice sharp but controlled. You've been with SkyLux for over 15 years, Rachel. You've built a reputation for professionalism, for making the first-class experience something extraordinary. But what you did to us was not professional. It was discriminatory, Camille continued, her gaze unwavering. You didn't just move us to the back of the plane. You made us feel unwelcome. You made us feel like we didn't belong. And that's something we won't ignore. Rachel's eyes filled with guilt. She had seen the signs, felt the growing discomfort, but now, facing their accusations head on, she realized just how much harm she had caused. She had treated them differently, and her actions, based on nothing more than unconscious bias, had violated the very core of what she had worked so hard to build. I, I'm so sorry, Rachel finally managed, her voice small and shaky. I didn't mean to. Camille cut her off, her voice firm but not without compassion. Apologies don't undo what happened. I understand that you didn't intend for this to happen, Rachel, but intention isn't everything. The harm was done, whether you meant it or not. James shifted in his seat, his gaze softening just a little. We're not here to attack you, Rachel. We're here because we believe in accountability. We believe in change. And we want you to understand that this isn't just about us. This is about every person who has ever been treated as if they didn't belong simply because of who they are or how they look. Rachel's mind spun as Camille's words hit her. She had been so focused on her perception of who belonged in first class that she had failed to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about her. It was about how she had reinforced a system that excluded people, that valued appearance over substance, and that allowed her to act on unconscious biases without even realizing it. We filed a formal complaint with HR, James said, his voice still calm but heavy with purpose, and we expect this to be addressed. But we also hope this will be a wake-up call for you, Rachel. We want you to understand what this has meant for us and, more importantly, what it could mean for everyone else. Rachel swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She could feel the weight of their words sinking in, and for the first time she truly understood the magnitude of what she had done. I understand, Rachel said quietly, her voice cracking. And I'm so sorry. I didn't see it at the time, but now I know what I did, and I know it was wrong. Camille's expression softened slightly. It's a start, Rachel. Acknowledging the problem is the first step toward change, but the journey doesn't end here. James nodded. We're not here to judge you, Rachel, but we do expect you to take this seriously. The company has its processes and they'll handle the investigation, but we want you to know that we're committed to ensuring that this doesn't happen again. To anyone. Rachel sat there in stunned silence, absorbing their words. She felt the weight of her mistake, but she also felt the faintest glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something better. A chance to learn, to grow, and to change. As she left the lounge, her mind was still reeling. The conversation with the Johnsons had been difficult, painful even, but it was also necessary. She couldn't deny it any longer. The truth had been laid bare before her, and now it was up to her to take the next step in this journey. Rachel sat at her desk in the small office, her hands trembling slightly as she read the email from HR. The subject line, "Action Required, Investigation Regarding Flight 306 Incident," loomed in her inbox like a dark cloud. She had been expecting this, but reading it felt different, like the moment when reality finally hits, cold and sharp. The words on the screen seemed to blur as her mind raced, but the gist of the message was clear. An official investigation was now underway, and Rachel was to be suspended pending the outcome. There would be interviews, reviews of her actions, and, most likely, a decision about whether she could continue working for SkyLux Airlines. The weight of the words hit harder than she had anticipated. Her career, the one she had built so carefully over the years, the one that had become so intertwined with her identity, was now at risk. The thought of losing it was like a sharp knife twisting in her chest. But what troubled her even more than the potential loss of her job was the gnawing feeling of guilt that refused to let go. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as a deep sense of helplessness settled over her. The events of the past few days played over and over in her mind, each moment more agonizing than the last. The conversation with the Johnsons, the formal complaint, the cold, hard truth that her own biases had led her to treat them with disrespect, even though they had done nothing wrong. I didn't mean, Rachel thought desperately. I just didn't see it. I didn't realize. But deep down, she knew that wasn't enough. Intentions didn't erase the harm that was done. No amount of justifying could change the fact that her actions had been driven by something deeper, something subconscious, a bias she had failed to confront for far too long. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She straightened up quickly, wiping her hands on her uniform. Melissa, the young flight attendant who had been alongside Rachel for months, stepped in. "Hey, Rachel," Melissa said, her voice soft. "I just wanted to check on you. I know things have been tough since the flight. Is there anything I can do?" Rachel smiled weakly, though the gesture didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks, Melissa. I'm just processing everything." Melissa hesitated before stepping closer, her tone sincere. "I don't know all the details, but I've worked with you long enough to know that you're a good person. You don't deserve to be going through this." Rachel shook her head, the lump in her throat growing. "I don't know, Melissa. I made a mistake, a big one, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can fix it." Melissa sat down across from Rachel, her expression compassionate. "You can. It's going to be hard, but you can learn from this. People make mistakes, but it's what you do afterward that counts." Rachel let out a long, shaky breath. "I never thought I could do something like this. I've always prided myself on treating everyone the same, but I didn't treat them the same. I I judged them based on how they looked, based on what I thought they should be, not who they really are." Melissa's gaze softened. "It's a tough thing to face, but I think you're already on the right path. Admitting it is the hardest part." Rachel smiled faintly. "I don't even know where to start. I feel like I've lost everything, my job, my reputation, and maybe even who I thought I was." Melissa reached across the desk and placed a hand on Rachel's. "You haven't lost everything, Rachel. You still have a chance to change. It's not going to be easy, but if anyone can make it through this, it's you." Rachel looked at her for a long moment, grateful for the comfort. But deep inside, the weight of the situation still pressed down on her chest. Could she really change? Could she truly overcome the biases she hadn't even known she had? She didn't know the answer, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Small, but real. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Rachel continued to reflect on her actions, thinking about what she could do next. She had already reached out to Sarah, her old college friend who worked in diversity and inclusion, hoping for guidance. She was still waiting for a response, but something told her that learning about unconscious bias and discrimination wasn't going to be a quick fix. It was going to be a long journey, one that would require self-reflection and hard work. As the day turned into evening, Rachel sat alone in her small apartment, staring at her laptop. She opened a search engine and typed in unconscious bias training before clicking on the first result. The resources she found were overwhelming. Articles, personal stories, courses. It was all new territory for her, and she couldn't help but feel both terrified and determined. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened the door to find her sister Leah standing on the other side. Leah had spent years working as a diversity consultant, and Rachel had never fully understood her sister's work until now. "Hey," Leah said softly, her expression warm but serious. "I got your message. You okay?" Rachel nodded, her throat tight. "I'm trying to be." Leah stepped inside, wrapping her arms around Rachel in a tight hug. "I know you're going through a lot right now, but I'm here to help. We're going to work through this together." Rachel's eyes welled with tears as she hugged her sister back. She felt the comfort of the embrace, but more than that, she felt the first spark of something, of hope, of the possibility of change. It was going to be hard, but maybe, just maybe, she could start this journey of redemption. The days following Rachel's suspension felt like a blur. She had spent much of her time reading articles, attending online workshops, and diving into the world of unconscious bias and discrimination, territory that was both new and difficult to navigate. She had reached out to Sarah, her old college friend, and they had spent hours talking about the deep rooted biases that shaped not only the way Rachel had acted on Flight 306, but also the way she had lived her life, unknowingly carrying the weight of judgment. But it wasn't easy. The lessons she learned didn't come quickly, nor did they come without resistance. Rachel had been trained for years to hold herself to an unyielding standard of professionalism. She had been trained to look past personal feelings and to manage passengers with a neutral, calm exterior. And now she was forced to confront the very biases she had long buried, those judgments that she realized had influenced her choices all along. Every day was an exercise in discomfort, but Rachel welcomed it now. She knew that this was her chance to change, to grow, to become the person she wanted to be, not just for her career, but for herself. A few weeks later, Rachel received a call from SkyLux's corporate office. She had been expecting it, but that didn't make the weight of it any less heavy. Her heart raced as she answered, and the voice on the other end was calm and professional, just as she had expected. "Miss Turner," the voice began, "after a thorough review of the situation and your participation in diversity and inclusion training, the company has decided to reinstate you. However, there will be a probationary period, during which you will be closely monitored. We expect you to continue your work on addressing unconscious bias and promoting a more inclusive environment in your role." Rachel swallowed hard. There it was, her chance to prove she could learn from her mistakes, her chance to show that she had truly changed. "Thank you," Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I understand, and I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to make things right." She ended the call, her hands still shaking slightly as she set down the phone. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope, not because things were perfect, but because she knew she had the opportunity to make a difference. Over the next few months, Rachel threw herself into her work and her self-improvement. She continued to attend workshops on bias, took courses on equity, and participated in discussions about how to create more inclusive environments in the workplace. Each day brought new challenges, but it also brought new insights. She began to have conversations with her colleagues, asking them about their experiences and learning from their perspectives. Rachel reached out to other flight attendants, some of whom had shared their own stories of subtle discrimination and listened without judgment. For the first time, she really heard the people around her, not just as coworkers, but as individuals with experiences and emotions that mattered. One day, during a routine flight, Rachel was serving drinks when she noticed a family that caught her eye. A woman and her child sat in the first class section, quietly chatting. The woman was dressed simply, but there was an elegance about her that made Rachel pause. Her first instinct was to judge. Was she really supposed to be in first class? But then Rachel stopped herself. She had learned to recognize that impulse, the one that came from years of unconscious bias. Instead of making assumptions, she smiled and approached the family. "Good evening, ma'am," Rachel said with a warm smile. "How are you enjoying the flight?" The woman looked up, surprised but appreciative. "It's been wonderful, thank you." Rachel felt a surge of pride. She wasn't just doing her job, she was doing it differently. She wasn't making assumptions based on appearances. She was connecting with people, treating them with respect and dignity, no matter their background or how they looked. As the flight continued, Rachel found herself reflecting on the journey she had made. She had started from a place of ignorance, from a place where she thought her actions were justified because they were rooted in years of experience. But now she understood that growth required humility, introspection, and a willingness to change. It was hard. Every day was a challenge, and she knew that her journey wasn't over. There would be setbacks, moments where her biases tried to creep back in. But Rachel was committed to learning, to becoming better, and to using her position to make a positive difference. A few months later, during a company-wide meeting, Rachel was asked to speak about her experience, about the lessons she had learned and the work she had done to become more aware of her biases. Standing in front of her colleagues, Rachel felt a mix of nerves and determination. She had learned so much, and now it was time to share it with others. I've made mistakes, Rachel began, her voice steady, and I've hurt people without even realizing it. But I've also learned something incredibly important about myself and about the way we see each other. We all have biases, whether we acknowledge them or not. The key is not to ignore them, but to face them head on, to learn from them, and to change. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm not perfect, but I'm working on it. And I want to make sure that we as a team continue to learn and grow together. As Rachel finished her speech, she looked around the room. There were nods of understanding, some colleagues even offering words of encouragement afterward. She had made an impact, not just through her words, but through the changes she had made in herself. But as she stood there, absorbing the quiet applause, something inside her shifted. The weight of everything, the guilt, the mistakes, the journey, wasn't something that could be washed away with a speech or a moment of validation. Rachel realized that this wasn't about one speech or one apology. It wasn't even about how her colleagues saw her now. It was about the deep, continuous work of being someone who actively sought change, not just when it was easy or convenient, but every day, in the smallest and biggest ways. She knew that the road ahead would still be challenging. There would be days when she would feel like she was slipping, when the biases she had worked so hard to confront would try to resurface, unnoticed. And there would be times when people would question whether her transformation was real, whether she had truly changed, or if this was just a temporary shift. But Rachel no longer felt the need for validation from others. She had started this journey to prove something to herself, not anyone else. And as she stood in front of her colleagues, she realized that the most important part of her journey was still to come: the continued process of change, the commitment to live out what she had learned, not just with words, but with actions. The applause faded, but Rachel's thoughts were clear. This was not the end of the road, but the beginning of something new. For the first time in a long time, she was at peace with the idea that the work was never truly done. Growth was a continuous process, one that would require patience, humility, and the willingness to face discomfort again and again. As she left the meeting room, a colleague stopped her and shook her hand. Rachel, I just wanted to say that what you said today really hit home. I can see how much you've grown. Rachel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of acknowledgement, a silent promise to herself that she would keep working, keep learning, and never stop changing. As she walked down the hallway, the weight she had carried for so long felt a little lighter. There would be setbacks, there would be challenges, but she no longer felt burdened by the past. Instead, she felt free. Free to continue her journey of growth, free to change, and free to help others along the way. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel realized that she was truly becoming the person she had always wanted to be. Not perfect, but always striving, always learning, always growing.